My mother-in-law smiled at me the way people smile at someone they feel sorry for. Not a mean smile. Almost worse, a pitying one. "So you're still doing the government thing?" she said, setting down her sweet tea like the question wasn't worth the energy it took to ask. I said yes. I smiled back. I did not explain. That was the first hour of Thanksgiving at my husband Daniel's parents' house in Naperville, Illinois. 11 people at a table built for 8. A turkey that had been discussed for 3 days before we arrived, and me sitting at the corner nearest the kitchen, which I was told was easier for getting up to help, and which I understood to mean was the seat nobody wanted. I have been with Daniel for 6 years, married for 3. In that time, I have sat at that corner seat at every major holiday. I have learned to pass the cranberry sauce before being asked. I have learned that his father, Robert, takes his coffee with exactly 1.5 sugars, that his sister, Melissa, thinks vaccines are a conversation and not a settled matter, and that his mother, Patricia, has never once asked me a follow-up question. She asks the first question. She listens to the first 2 sentences of the answer. And then her eyes drift, very gently, to someone else in the room. Daniel's family is not cruel. That is the thing I kept telling myself for years. They are not cruel people. They are just people who decided very early that I was not quite worth the full weight of their attention. I am a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice, Northern District of Illinois. I have been for 4 years. Before that, I clerked for a federal judge for 2 years, passed the bar on my first attempt, and graduated in the top 5% of my class at Northwestern Law. I do not say this to brag. I say this because for 3 years, every time the subject of my work came up at that table, Patricia would nod slowly and say something like, "That must keep you busy," and then pivot immediately to asking Daniel's brother-in-law, Marcus, how the car dealership was doing. Marcus owns 2 Chevy dealerships in the western suburbs. He talks about floor traffic and financing rates the way other men talk about their children. Patricia lights up for him the way a lamp lights up when you flip the switch. Immediate, full brightness. I used to try to explain what I did. The first Thanksgiving, I told him I was working a healthcare fraud case involving a network of clinics, billing Medicare for procedures that were never performed. Patricia said, "Oh, that sounds complicated," and passed Marcus the green bean casserole. By the second year, I had stopped trying to make it interesting to them. By the third, I had stopped bringing it up unless directly asked. Daniel knew. He saw it every time. In the car afterward, he would say, "She doesn't mean anything by it." And I would look out the passenger window at the tollway lights going by and say, "I know." Because I did know. That was almost the problem. She didn't mean anything by it. That's exactly how little it was. This particular Thanksgiving was the one I almost didn't go to. The week before, I had been in the middle of the biggest case of my career. I cannot say more than what became public record, but I will say this. It involved a sitting alderman, a network of shell companies, and enough wire fraud to put multiple people away for a decade each. The grand jury had been convened. The indictments were drafted. We were 48 hours from a filing that would be, as my supervisor put it, the kind of thing that gets mentioned in your obituary. I had told my supervisor I might need to skip the holiday. She told me to go. She said the filing team was airtight, that my second chair could handle the final review, and that I needed to not be in the office for 2 days or I was going to lose my mind. She was right. I packed a bag for Naperville and drove west on I-88 on Wednesday afternoon while my second chair texted me updates I was trying very hard not to obsessively read. We arrived at the house at 6 in the evening. Patricia hugged Daniel for a long time. She hugged me for a shorter time. She took Daniel's coat and asked if he was warm enough. She took my coat and said the closet was right there. Dinner was at 2 on Thursday. By noon, the living room had filled up. Robert and Patricia, Daniel's older brother Kevin and his wife Steph, Melissa and Marcus, their 3 kids running laps around the sectional, and Patricia's sister, Aunt Donna, who had driven up from Bloomington and who I genuinely liked because she had absolutely no filter and said exactly what she thought at all times. I was in the kitchen helping Patricia with the rolls when Melissa came in to refill her wine and said, "Without preamble, I saw on LinkedIn that you're still at the DOJ. How long do you stay before you go to a real firm?" I turned the roll pan over in my hands. I like what I do. I'm just saying Marcus knows some partners at Jenner and Block. The money would be different. I'm not looking to move. She shrugged the way people shrug when they think you're being naive. Well, the offer stands. She took her wine and left. Patricia, who had heard all of this, said nothing. She stirred her gravy. Dinner was fine. Dinner was always fine. Marcus talked about the dealerships. Kevin talked about a kitchen renovation they were planning. Robert asked Daniel about his firm. Aunt Donna told a story about a raccoon that got into her garage that was genuinely funny and made the whole table laugh. I ate my turkey. I asked the kids about school. I was perfectly pleasant. I was always perfectly pleasant. I was always perfectly pleasant. Then Robert said, setting down his fork, "We should do a round. Everyone say what they're thankful for." It went around the table. The kids said video games and their dog. Kevin said family and the Bears finally having a decent offensive line. Steph said her health. Marcus said the Q3 numbers, which got a laugh. Melissa said her family and her wellness journey, which she had mentioned 3 times already that day. Patricia said she was thankful everyone was together under one roof. Then it came to me. I'm thankful for the work, I said. I had a hard week, but I believe in what I'm doing. There was a small silence. Not hostile. Just the particular silence of people who don't know what to do with an answer that isn't simple. Robert nodded. Good, good. And moved on to Daniel. After dessert, while the kids were watching something in the living room and the men had drifted toward the football game, I was stacking plates when Patricia came to stand beside me at the counter. She had a look on her face like she was about to say something kind, which was almost more exhausting than anything else. I just want you to know, she said, that we're glad Daniel has someone so dedicated. It's just, you work so much, and someday when you have children, you'll want to have more balance. I stacked another plate. I appreciate that. Marcus and Melissa have such a nice arrangement. She stepped back from the pharmaceutical sales when the kids came, and it's been wonderful for the whole family. I kept my face still. Every family's different. Of course. She patted my arm once, lightly, and went back to the living room. I stood at that sink for a moment. The water was running. The kitchen smelled like sage and butter. And I thought about 48 hours from now, when my name would be on an indictment that would be on the front page of the Tribune, and possibly above the fold. I thought about my second chair, a 27-year-old named Travis who had worked harder on this case than he'd worked on anything in his life. I thought about the alderman who had been stealing from the city for 11 years, and the Medicare network, and the wire fraud, and the 212 pages of evidence that I had lived inside for the better part of a year. I turned off the water. I dried my hands. I went to watch football. My phone started at 8:37 p.m. The first call was from Travis. I declined it. He called again 30 seconds later. I stepped away from the living room and answered. "There's a problem," he said. I walked into the hallway and lowered my voice. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where DOJ Main Justice called your supervisor directly, tonight, on a holiday." I felt something go still inside me. Talk. He talked. For 3 minutes, without stopping, he laid out what had happened. I will not describe the details, but I will say this. There was a development in the case that required an immediate response. A deadline that had moved. A decision that could not wait 48 hours. My supervisor was on the phone with Main Justice. Main Justice needed me. "Where's Peterson?" "Peterson was my supervisor. She's on another line. She said to get you. She said specifically to get you." "I'm in Naperville." "I know. She knows. She said get in the car." I hung up. I stood in the hallway for exactly 4 seconds. Then I walked into the living room and told Daniel I needed to go back to the city. He looked at me. He could read my face well enough by now to know this was not a conversation. "Tonight?" "Now." Patricia looked up from her end of the couch. "Is everything okay?" "Work situation," I said. "I'm sorry to cut the evening short. On Thanksgiving?" Daniel was already getting up to help me find my coat. "She has an important job, Mom." It was the first time in 3 years I had heard him say it that way. Not apologetically, just factually. An important job. I had my coat on and my bag in my hand in 4 minutes. I was saying my goodbyes at the door when my phone rang again. I looked at the screen. It was not Travis. It was not Peterson. It was a number with a 202 area code that I recognized immediately. I answered. "Counselor," said the voice on the other end. It was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division. I had spoken to her twice before in my career. Both times had been significant moments. "I need you back in the city. Tonight. I'm sorry about the holiday." "I'm on my way," I said. "Good. We're sending a car. It'll be at the Naperville address in 22 minutes. I almost said that wasn't necessary, that I had my own car. I stopped myself, because the truth was that if Maine Justice was sending a car on Thanksgiving night, this had moved beyond the point where my preference about transportation was the relevant consideration. "Thank you," I said. "I'll be ready." I hung up. Patricia was standing in the hallway with a piece of leftover pie wrapped in foil, which she had clearly been intending to send me off with. She was looking at me with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. Not the pitying smile. Not the polite but distant look. Something more like recalibration. "They're sending a car?" she said. "Yes, from Washington? From the field office. They coordinated through Maine Justice." She held the pie for a moment. "For your government thing. For my case. Yes." Daniel squeezed my hand. Aunt Donna, who had appeared in the hallway behind Patricia, was looking at me with a wide grin and said nothing at all, which was the most respectful thing she could have done. We waited on the front porch. It was 29 degrees and the neighborhood was quiet the way suburbs get quiet on major holidays. That particular stillness where all the noise is happening inside houses and the streets belong to the cold. Daniel had his arm around my shoulders. I could see my breath. The car arrived in 19 minutes. A black Suburban with government plates and 2 occupants in the front. It pulled up to the curb and stopped. I heard the front door open behind us. Marcus had come outside. Then Kevin. Then Robert. They had all heard the car being discussed and they had come to look, the way men do when something happens. They don't quite have a framework for. The agent in the passenger seat lowered the window. "Counselor?" he said. "Yes," I said. "We're ready when you are." I kissed Daniel. He said, "Call me when you can." I said, "I know." I picked up my bag and walked to the Suburban and I did not look back. But I heard the porch behind me. I heard the quality of silence that falls when people who have been talking suddenly stop. I got in. The door closed. The car pulled away from the curb and moved down the quiet street toward the highway. My phone lit up with a text from Aunt Donna. It said, Girl. I smiled in the dark. "I will tell you what happened with the case because it is public record. We filed the indictments at 11 the following morning. The alderman surrendered himself to the federal courthouse in Chicago on Friday afternoon with 2 attorneys and a very expensive suit. The Tribune ran it above the fold. The Sun-Times ran it above the fold. The story was picked up nationally by Friday evening. My name was in the 3rd paragraph of every version of the story. Daniel sent me a photo. It was a screenshot of a text message from Patricia. It said, "Is that the same case your wife has been working on?" He had written back, "Yes, Mom," for almost a year. There was a long pause in the messages. The kind you can see because the timestamps jump. Then Patricia had written, "Oh. Just that. Oh." I was in the office when I read it. I had been there since 9 the previous night, running on terrible vending machine coffee and the particular kind of adrenaline that comes when you have been carrying something enormous for a long time, and you finally get to set it down. Travis was asleep on the couch in the conference room under his jacket. 2 of my colleagues were at the whiteboard going through next steps. My supervisor was on the phone with someone in Washington. I read the screenshot and I held my phone for a moment. Not because I felt triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I had expected to feel triumphant. What I felt was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a thing finally being true out loud that had always been true and had simply never been acknowledged. I had never needed Patricia to understand what I did. I'd told myself that for years. And I had believed it, and I still believed it. But there is a difference between not needing something and not noticing its absence. And the absence, I realized, sitting there in my office the day after Thanksgiving, had been there every time. Every corner seat. Every pivot to Marcus. Every "that must keep you busy." It had been there. I texted Daniel back. I said, "Tell her the pie was good." Because it had been. Patricia makes an excellent sweet potato pie, and that is simply true regardless of anything else. The following Sunday, when I went to pick up Daniel from his parents' house where he'd stayed for the weekend, Patricia met me at the door. She didn't do the shorter hug. She held on for a moment that felt deliberate. She said, "I read the article, the whole thing." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I didn't understand most of it." And then she paused. But I understood it mattered. It wasn't an apology. I'm not sure it needed to be. It was something more like a door cracking open that had been closed for a long time. Not thrown wide, not dramatic, just a few inches of light coming through. I drove home on I-88 in the early dark of December. Daniel next to me. The tollway lights going past in long orange streaks. I was tired in the way you are when something is over and your body finally believes it. The radio was on low. Neither of us was talking. After a while, Daniel reached over and turned the radio off. He said, "She's going to try, I think." I kept my eyes on the road. Okay, she wants to. She didn't know how to see you. I know. Does that bother you? I thought about it honestly. The corner seat. The drift of eyes. The years of being the least visible person in that house. I thought about walking to that Suburban in the cold while the porch went quiet behind me. I thought about Travis asleep under his jacket. I thought about 220 pages of evidence and a man who had stolen from the city for 11 years and who was, right now, in a great deal of trouble. It used to, I said. The lights kept going past. The highway stretched out ahead of us, straight and flat the way Illinois highways are, all the way to the city. Not anymore, I said. And that was true. I keep thinking about that corner seat. Not the Suburban pulling up to the curb. Not the porch going quiet. Not Patricia's face when she heard the words, "They're sending a car." I keep thinking about the corner seat nearest the kitchen, the one I had been given every holiday for 3 years because it was easier for getting up to help. I sat in that seat and I passed the cranberry sauce and I smiled and I said, "I appreciate that," when I was told I needed more balance in my life. I did all of that. And I kept doing my job anyway. That is the part I want to sit with, because I think it is the only part that actually matters. There is a version of the story where I am bitter, where I spent those 3 years building a quiet resentment, cataloging every drifted glance and every pivot to Marcus and every "that must keep you busy." I could have done that. It would have been easy. What Patricia did was small and consistent and invisible enough that no one would have blamed me for carrying it like a wound. But I didn't, not really, and I have been trying to understand why. I think it is because I knew what I was doing, not in an arrogant way, in a grounded way. I knew the case file. I knew the 212 pages. I knew what Travis and I had built and what it meant and what it was going to do. And when you know that about your own work, when you have looked at it honestly and you believe in it, other people's opinions of it stop being the measure. They become information sometimes, or they become noise, but they stop being the measure. That is not something anyone told me. It is something I had to build slowly, the same way you build anything that holds weight. You make the decision to keep going when it is not being recognized. You make it again the next day. You do the work when the room is not watching, and when the room is watching, and when the room has decided you are not worth watching at all. You do it anyway, not to prove something, just because the work is real and you are the one responsible for it. And then one day, a car with government plates pulls up to the curb in the cold, and the porch goes quiet, and you pick up your bag and you walk toward it, and you do not look back. I think about Patricia reading that Tribune article. The whole thing, she said. I didn't understand most of it, but I understood it mattered. That sentence has stayed with me. Not because it was an apology. It wasn't quite, but because it was honest. She saw something she hadn't seen before, and she said so. There is a kind of integrity in that, even when it comes late. What I know is this. The outcome wasn't the point. The Suburban was not the point. The above-the-fold headline was not the point. The point was, the year before all of that, when no one was watching and the work still had to be done, and I did it. Characters built in the invisible time. Intelligence is sharpened by the problems that don't have easy answers. And the will to continue, that quiet, stubborn decision to keep going when the room has already made up its mind about you, That is the thing that carries you to the moment when the room has to reconsider. I drove home on I-88 in December dark and I told Daniel it used to bother me. Not anymore. That was true. I meant it. And I think the reason it was true is that I hadn't been waiting for Patricia to see me clearly. I had already seen myself clearly. That turned out to be enough.